The belief that psychological healing results in a docile, meek, and eternally gentle personality is one of the most dangerous illusions of modernity. The individuation process, as conceived by Carl Jung, does not seek moral perfection, but wholeness. Becoming whole does not mean purifying oneself of one's own rough edges, but rather giving a place in the sun to all that has been exiled to darkness. True transformation does not produce a saint, but a sovereign individual, someone who possesses teeth and claws, but chooses when and how to use them. For the empath, the one who feels overwhelmed by the emotional tides of the world, the journey does not begin with more love, but with the recognition of their own capacity for destruction. The empath often confuses their fragility with virtue, believing that their inability to set boundaries is a spiritual gift, when in reality it is a form of psychic porosity. This porosity is an open wound, an absence of psychological skin that allows the unconscious of others to invade your sacred territory, transforming you into a plaything of forces you do not understand. Carl Jung emerges as the figure holding the lantern before this abyss. He observes the empath not with pity, but with the seriousness of one who sees a kingdom in disarray. For Jung, the empath lives in a state of mystical participation, a term that describes the primal fusion between the self and the other, where the boundaries of identity are fluid and unstable. The empath does not feel the other out of conscious compassion. He feels the other because he does not know where he himself ends and where the world begins. This lack of psychological sovereignty is what Jung would identify as a negative inflation of the ego. In trying to bear the world's pain, the individual denies his own finitude and, paradoxically, flees the responsibility of confronting his own shadow. The empath's kindness is often a protective mask against the fear of conflict. It is safer to be a sensitive victim than a conscious executioner. However, Jung reminds us that no one becomes enlightened by imagining figures of light, but rather by making the darkness conscious. The shadow is the first great gateway. It contains everything the empath has rejected in themselves to maintain the image of the being of light: anger, selfishness, aggression, and the desire for power. As long as these forces remain in the basement of the psyche, they will act autonomously and destructively, sabotaging relationships and draining vitality. The empath feels exhausted because they expend colossal energy trying to keep the lid on the cauldron of their own shadow. Jung teaches us that the shadow is not an enemy to be defeated, but a Siamese twin that holds the key to our life force. Without the integration of the shadow, empathy is merely a form of emotional servitude. Psychological sovereignty is only born when the individual accepts that they are capable of cruelty. Only those who recognize their own potential for evil can truly choose good. Others are only harmless through incapacity, not virtue. In this initial stage of metamorphosis, psychic porosity begins to be replaced by the construction of an alchemical vessel. The empath must learn to close the doors of their perception so that their essence is not lost in the collective. Jung points out that individuation requires a certain degree of isolation and the courage to be unpopular. Sovereignty demands that the individual reclaim the projections they have cast onto the world. If the empath sees the world as a cruel place that devours them, they must ask themselves what part of their own aggression they are projecting outwards. By removing these projections, the world ceases to be a monster and becomes a mirror. It is a painful process of disillusionment. The empath needs to abandon the addiction of being necessary to others in order to begin being necessary to themselves. Sensitivity, once a curse that made them vulnerable to any external vibration, must be refined by discriminative intelligence. Jung's presence is constant and rigorous, reminding us of Carl Jung walks silently down a corridor of veiled mirrors, where each reflection seems to pulsate with a life that doesn't belong to it. He observes the figure of the empath, seated in the center of a room without walls, whose pores seem too open, vulnerable to every emotional breeze blowing from the outside world. Jung approaches, and his voice resonates not as an external sound, but as a perception emerging from the depths of the soul. He speaks of unconscious participation, that primitive and archaic state where the boundaries between the self and the non-self dissolve into a dangerous fog. The empath, in their desperate search for connection, has fallen into the trap of mystical participation, where the pain of the other ceases to be an object of observation and becomes the very substance of their identity. Jung points to the individual's chest, where a dark, dense mass begins to form. He explains that, lacking a solid psychic vessel, the empath transforms into a repository for the dark material that others cannot or will not carry. It is a silent process of psychic colonization. When someone projects their repressed anger, unprocessed sadness, or hidden envy, the empath absorbs these fragments as if they were their own. They believe they are being compassionate, that they are healing the world by feeling its agony. But Jung warns that this is an ego illusion disguised as sanctity. This individual's identity begins to be woven from the threads of others' tragedies. Without the pain of others, he feels a terrifying emptiness, for he has forgotten what it is like to inhabit his own inner home. He becomes the collector of the collective's psychic garbage, a lightning rod for the human shadow that wanders in search of a host. Jung observes how this process of absorption creates a paradoxical inflation of the ego. The empath feels special for his capacity to suffer for everyone, while in reality, he is losing contact with the only reality that could save him, which is his own individuation. The self-abandoner disguises his flight from himself under the cloak of empathy. It is much easier to carry the cross of a stranger than to face the dragon that guards one's own inner treasure. Jung walks around the figure, noting how the empath becomes a puppet of collective emotional currents. If the environment is charged with anxiety, he becomes anxiety itself. If there is mourning in the air, he drowns in tears that do not originate from his personal history. This porosity is not a gift, but a pathology of the boundary. The soul, deprived of its limit, evaporates into the ocean of the collective unconscious, leaving behind only a shell that reacts to external stimuli. The tragedy of the unhealed empath, as Jung gravely points out, is that he becomes a martyr without a cause. He absorbs the collective shadow, that accumulation of denied impulses and unspoken truths of society, and begins to manifest the symptoms of an illness that is not his own. He is the repository where the world deposits what is ugly and unbearable. In doing so, he deprives the other of the opportunity to confront their own shadow, interrupting the other's maturation process while annihilating his own. True compassion demands a sacred distance. It requires that I remain myself so that I can reach out to you. But the empath, in his unconscious participation, leaps into the abyss along with the sufferer, and now there are two drowning people instead of one. Jung touches the figure's shoulder and makes him look into a mirror that does not reflect the neighbor's face, but his own inner desert. He shows that addiction to the pain of others is a way of avoiding the disturbing silence of one's own soul. Where is your desire? Where is your own shadow, the one you neglected while trying to wipe away the shadows of others? The empath begins to realize that their sensitivity has often been an inverted armor, a form of control. By feeling everything the other feels, they try to anticipate danger and neutralize the threat before it reaches them. but the price is the total loss of psychic sovereignty. Jung explains that the absorbed dark material begins to somatize, transforming into chronic exhaustion, illnesses that doctors cannot explain, and a nameless melancholy. It is the weight of the world crushing an individual who has forgotten to build their own walls. The identity built on the pain of others is a ghost identity. To return to life, the empath needs to commit what seems to be an act of supreme selfishness in their own eyes. They must close the doors. They must learn to say, "This is yours, not mine." Jung emphasizes that true healing begins when the individual withdraws their savior projections and accepts humility. Carl Jung walks silently along the lakeshore, observing how the water, though seemingly placid on the surface, hides deep currents and invisible whirlpools. He pauses and looks at you, not with the pity of a comforter, but with the precision of a surgeon of the soul. He knows you have just been struck at the most vulnerable point of your psychic architecture: betrayal from someone you protected, nurtured, and defended. For the empath, this moment is not merely an interpersonal disappointment. It is an ontological collapse. You believed your kindness was an insurmountable shield, a bargaining chip that would guarantee loyalty and gratitude. Yet, the figure you carried on your shoulders has just sunk its teeth into your neck. Jung smiles slightly, not out of cruelty, but because he understands that this is the beginning of your true initiation. He explains that betrayal is the necessary catalyst to break the persona of the eternal giver and force an encounter with the darkest face of one's own nature. Who is the real traitor? The one who delivered the blow, or the part of you that ignored all the signs in the name of an artificial sanctity? To what extent was your need to be indispensable to the other the rope you yourself wove for your own hanging? What remains of your identity when the gratitude of the other ceases to be the mirror that confirms your existence? The pain of betrayal is often masked by a lament of injustice, but Jung invites you to look beyond victimhood. He points out that the empath often uses protecting the other as a refined form of control and an escape from their own aggression. By positioning yourself as the permanent savior of someone wounded, you have denied that person the dignity of their own struggle and, simultaneously, buried your own capacity to say no and to exercise power. The betrayal you suffer now is the return of the repressed. The protected one becomes the aggressor because they cannot bear the weight of the emotional debt that you, in your generosity, imposed upon them. Jung observes that the empath's shadow is often composed of passive aggression and a hidden moral superiority. Now, confronted with the rupture, you are forced to look at the claws you always had, but preferred to call short nails. The integration of the shadow is not a gentle process of self-acceptance. It is a violent descent into the basement where you kept your potential for destruction. Where does your empathy end and your complicity in your own ruin begin? Can you recognize that your inability to set boundaries was, in fact, a silent invitation for the other to invade you? If you refuse to be a wolf when necessary, how can you expect not to be devoured by those who live according to the law of the psychic jungle? Jung now walks towards the dense forest, indicating that healing lies not in hasty forgiveness, but in recognizing one's own capacity for danger. He states that a man who is incapable of being ugly and cruel is not truly good. He is merely harmless, and harmlessness is a form of weakness, not virtue. The betrayal suffered is the mirror that reveals one's own potential for rupture. It forces one to access the anger one has always considered unspiritual. This anger is the necessary fuel for individuation. Without the capacity to break free, to destroy toxic ties, and to recognize that one too possesses a predatory instinct, one will remain a fragment, a half of a human being seeking completeness through futile sacrifice. The integration of the shadow requires one to admit that there was unconscious complicity in one's own dissolution. One allowed the invasion because deep down, one feared the loneliness that comes from being an authority over oneself. If your kindness made you a victim, was it truly kindness or merely a chronic fear of confrontation? What dies within you today so that the sovereign individual can finally be born? Are you willing to accept that the monster that betrayed you potentially dwells within your own psyche, waiting to be integrated as a defense mechanism? Jung stands before an ancient tree and touches its rough trunk, remembering that for the branches to reach the sky, the roots must descend to hell. Betrayal is this plunge into the roots. It destroys the illusion that the world is a safe place populated by people who share your code of ethics. It throws you into the raw reality of the human psyche, where selfishness and the pursuit of power are driving forces. By recognizing that the other was capable of betraying you, despite all your dedication, you are freed from the responsibility of saving the world. This death of your idealized image is what allows true strength. You discover that you can survive the rupture, that your essence does not depend on the approval or presence of those you tried to fix. Carl Jung walks through a garden where the mist seems to have a will of its own, moving among the trees as if searching for something to cling to. He stops before a fountain whose water doesn't flow, but only accumulates the sediment of fallen leaves. He observes the empath, the one who spent years believing that his sensitivity was a curse of absolute porosity. For Jung, the tragedy of the empath is not feeling too much, but rather the absence of a psychic membrane that separates the self from the non-self. He begins to speak in that deep voice that seems to come from within the earth itself, explaining that the first step to healing is not isolation, but the cessation of absorption. He calls this conscious differentiation. It is the moment when the soul decides that it will no longer be the repository of psychic waste for a humanity that refuses to carry its own shadow. Absorption is an almost magnetic process. The empath, in their unconscious desire to be helpful or out of fear of rejection, opens their emotional centers as if they were dry sponges. When a manipulator or a wounded person enters their field, the empath absorbs the other's anxiety, anger, and guilt, processing these emotions in their own body as if they were their own. Jung points to the stagnant source and explains that, by doing so, the empath prevents the other from growing. By carrying the other's weight, they rob the other of the opportunity to face their own destiny. Conscious differentiation begins with a cold, cutting perception. What I am feeling does not belong to me. It is the birth of an inner observer who, instead of drowning in the emotional flood, climbs a watchtower and observes the water passing by without being touched by it. The image of this process is surprising and almost violent in its clarity. Imagine that the empath, once a bottomless pit swallowing every stone of guilt thrown at them, suddenly transforms into a polished silver mirror. When the manipulator launches their burden of victimhood or accusation, expecting the gentle impact of absorption, they find only the reflection of their own face. Mirroring is the act of returning the projection without contamination. If someone says, "You're selfish for not helping me," the exceptional empath doesn't seek to defend themselves or absorb the accusation to feel bad. They simply observe the other person's emotion and, silently or with few words, allow the weight of that phrase to return to its point of origin. The effect of this on the power dynamic is devastating for manipulation. Jung describes how manipulation through guilt depends entirely on a psychic hook within the empath. Guilt only works if there is a part of us that believes we are responsible for the happiness of others. When differentiation occurs, this hook is dissolved by the light of consciousness. The manipulator, accustomed to seeing the empath writhe in excuses and self-accusation, suddenly encounters a receptive void. It's as if he's punching the air. The lack of resistance causes him to lose his balance. There is something terrifying for the manipulator in the gaze of an empath who has stopped absorbing. It is the gaze of someone who sees the shadow of another, but does not allow themselves to be possessed by it. Guilt, which was once a heavy chain binding the two, becomes a wisp of smoke that dissipates the moment it touches the surface of the conscious mirror. At this stage, the empath experiences a strange feeling of lightness that can initially be mistaken for coldness. Jung reminds us that this coldness is, in fact, the temperature of integrity. To be truly compassionate, one must be detached. If two beings are drowning, no one saves anyone. The empath who stops absorbing the emotional garbage of others finally has their hands free to offer real help, which is not carrying the other's burden, but pointing out that the other is capable of carrying it. The image of the destruction of manipulation is that of a puppet theater where the strings are suddenly cut. The manipulator falls, not because of the empath's malice, but because the energy that sustained the drama, the absorption, has ceased. Jung now walks toward the center of the garden, where the mist begins to dissipate, revealing clear forms. He explains that conscious differentiation requires almost superhuman courage, as the empath must be willing to be seen as evil or insensitive by those who previously fed off their energy. However, it is in this space of non-absorption that true individuality begins to flourish. The empath ceases to be. Carl Jung steps away from the window, where the snow falls silently on the Kusnacht mountains, and turns to you with a gaze that pierces the superficial layers of consciousness. He offers no comfort, but a warning. The stage of passivity is over. For the empath who has survived the desert of exhaustion, the next step requires the integration of something civilization has tried, unsuccessfully, to tame: sacred aggression. Jung sits in his leather armchair, the crackling of firewood in the fireplace punctuating the dense silence. He explains that boundless kindness is, in fact, a form of cowardice, a disguise of the persona to avoid confronting one's own shadow. Here, we enter Stage 2, aggressive selectivity. Jung observes that empaths often confuse being nice with being kind. The nice individual is a prisoner of fear. They avoid conflict because their identity depends on the approval of others. They are harmless, not out of virtue, but out of an inability to bite. Kindness, in its profound and alchemical sense, is a function of clarity. Being kind requires the courage to be cruel to lies. Aggressive selectivity is not an act of gratuitous violence, but a surgical pruning process. The integrated empath realizes that their energy is a finite and sacred resource. They begin to look at parasitic dynamics and, with the precision of a blade, cut the threads. There is no more room for endless explanations or apologies for existing. Aggression here is the absolute no that protects the inner sanctuary. It is the moment when the empath ceases to be the prey that feels the predator's pain and becomes the guardian who recognizes the wolf even before it howls. As this selectivity stabilizes, the empath's nervous system undergoes a perceptual mutation. Jung leans forward, the firelight etching wrinkles of wisdom into his face. He describes Stage 3, predictive ability. What was once chaotic and painful sensitivity now organizes itself into a sophisticated detection system. The empath not only feels what the other feels in the present, he begins to process the probable trajectories of the other's soul. It is a form of intuition bordering on precognition, but grounded in the microscopic reading of archetypal patterns. You look at someone and you don't just see the smile of the persona. You see the trail of destruction that still unintegrated shadow will leave in the coming months. The empath becomes operationally dangerous because he removes the veil of time. He sees the end of a relationship in the first handshake. He detects betrayal while it is still just an unformed thought in the other's mind. This capacity creates an unbearable ethical tension. Jung pauses, allowing the weight of this responsibility to settle in the room. The integrated empath now walks a tightrope. If you can foresee the blow, do you have the right to strike back before the aggression is even manifest? Herein lies the danger of becoming the monster you fight. Ethical integrity becomes the only anchor. The operationally dangerous empath is the one who possesses the power to shatter the illusions of anyone around them, to expose the most secret wounds with a single phrase, but chooses silence or precise intervention. The narrative tension of the empath's life is no longer about surviving the world, but about containing their own power. You become a high-frequency radar in a world that operates on short waves. The atmosphere in Jung's office becomes electric. He speaks of the transcendent function, where the empath ceases to be a victim of emotional currents and becomes the master of the tides. The detection system is now so refined that the empath senses the cognitive dissonance of an environment as soon as they enter it. The walls speak, not with voices, but with the psychic charge left by unspoken intentions. It is a state of constant vigilance, where peace is only possible through rigorous selective isolation. The empath no longer seeks the crowd to heal it. They seek silence, so as not to be contaminated by the disintegration of others. The operational danger lies in the fact that the empath now possesses X-ray vision for the collective shadow. They can no longer be manipulated because manipulation requires the victim to share the same blindness as the manipulator. Jung rises and walks to his desk, picking up a quill pen. He writes that the price of this evolution is a profound yet sovereign solitude. The integrated empath is a sentinel on the border between the conscious and the unconscious. He is no longer the nice guy everyone loves to use, but the gentle one many fear to encounter, for his mere presence demands truth. Selective aggression has cleared the ground. Predictive ability has mapped the territory. Now, the empath must decide what to do with the sword he forged in the fire of his own pain. His heart races, for the next step is not about feeling, but about acting with the authority of one who knows the secrets of the ebb. Carl Jung walks slowly through a garden where the roots of the trees intertwine visibly above the earth, like the exposed nerves of a collective psyche. He stops, observes the complexity of these connections, and turns his gaze to you with an expression that blends severity and profound compassion. He understands that the journey you have undertaken so far, emerging from the fog of reactive empathy into the clarity of individuation, was not merely a personal movement, but an act of rebellion against familiar destiny. Jung knows that when a single element of a system moves consciously, the entire system is forced to readjust. The awakened empath is like a stone thrown into a stagnant lake. The ripples he generates do not ask permission, they simply advance, touching every shore, every floating leaf, every shadow hidden in the depths. In this final stage, you need to understand the cascading effect of your transformation. For a long time, You were the lightning rod for others' tensions, the reservoir where family and partners deposited the pain they didn't want to feel. By choosing individuation, you cease to be that receptacle. Jung points to the roots and explains that your healing is a direct threat to the imbalance that kept the system functioning in a sick way. When you stop absorbing the shadow of others, that shadow returns to its original owners. This is where the phenomenon of evolution or revelation occurs. Your light, gained through confronting your own abyss, now acts as a spotlight that cannot be turned off. Those around you are faced with an inevitable choice. Either they evolve, seeking their own consciousness to keep up with your new frequency, or they reveal themselves in their refusal to grow. The empath's transformation is the catalyst for a necessary crisis in relationships. Jung observes that many will distance themselves from you, and they will do so angrily, calling your new stance selfishness or coldness. But what they call selfishness is, in fact, your refusal to continue being a silent accomplice to their stagnation. Individuation forces others to look at themselves because you are no longer there to distract them from their own wounds. For some, your change will be the sacred invitation they have been waiting for to also begin their journeys. For others, it will be an unbearable mirror they will try to break. Don't feel guilty about this rupture. The Master reminds us that no relationship can be true if it is based on the annihilation of one of the parties. By becoming who you truly are, you give others the most difficult and precious gift in the world: responsibility for their own destiny. Feel now the weight and lightness of this responsibility. The ripple effect doesn't stop with your family. It extends through generations, healing past ancestors who couldn't speak and protecting future generations. You are breaking unconscious contracts of suffering that were signed centuries before you were born. Jung approaches and places his hand on your shoulder, conveying the idea that the loneliness you felt at the beginning of the process is being replaced by a much deeper connection with the totality of life. You are no longer fused to the other by fear or neediness, but united with the world through awareness. Empathy, which was once an open wound, is now a tool of discernment. You feel the other, but you don't lose yourself in them. You see the other's pain, but you don't try to steal it for yourself, because you know that pain is everyone's master. This closure is not an end, but the inauguration of a new way of existing. The individuated empath is the lighthouse that remains steadfast while the waves crash. It does not try to calm the sea. It simply shines so that the boats know where the land is. Jung smiles slightly, indicating that the work of the soul never ends, but that from now on, you possess the necessary compass. Personal transformation is the only real revolution. When you change, the universe around you has no choice but to reorganize itself around your new truth. It is a painful process, yes, but it is the only one that leads to freedom. The call now is for you to fully inhabit this new space you have conquered within yourself. Look back one last time and see the path you've traveled. See the previous versions of yourself that were left behind. Honor the suffering that brought you here, but don't cling to it. You are now the architect of your own boundaries and the guardian of your own light. The world needs individuals who have the courage to be whole, because only those who are whole can offer something of real value to the collective. The soul's journey is solitary in its essence, but its fruits nourish everyone. May your presence now be a silent invitation for others to awaken as well, as may your life be a testament to the fact that it is possible to transmute the burden of sensitivity into the power of wisdom. If this dive into the depths of analytical psychology and the empath's journey touched your soul and brought clarity to your internal processes, I invite you to speak up. Your journey is unique, but it doesn't need to be traveled in absolute silence. Like this video, if it served as a mirror to your truth, comment below on which part of your transformation has been the most challenging or rewarding.